This is Houston, contact with a test 1, 2.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston saying.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So Starfield by Bethesda Game Studios came out recently. A game about space, exploration, and individual stories. But while the game isn't a historically based game, they do draw historical inspirations, such as the NASA projects, especially the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo mission mindsets. I'm Eric the LonePineWolfman. Thank you for watching. Let's get to it. The primary goal of the early NASA missions was exploration and increasing the US's capability in all things space. While looking at the missions separately, without any kind of background or idea, these might seem like fanciful hobbies of shooting dudes into space and trying to get them back down alive. While it is true to some degree, the missions actually followed a pattern. Very few people realize that all the early programs were partially running at the same time, employed thousands upon thousands of people, and helped to create many technologies that we use today. Everything from modern home insulation to electronic water filtration systems, even the computer mouse. One other thing about these missions, each project was not an isolated experiment of space travel, but all were intended to build on each other and tackle individual goals while all heading towards the idea of deeper exploration of space, from traveling to the moon to potential base building and further missions, pushing out slowly towards the stars.
One of the problems facing man when he first begins to travel in space is whether or not he can properly orient himself and control the flight attitude of his space vehicle. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has constructed a multi-axis test facility at its Lewis Research Center in Cleveland. With this facility, it is possible to reproduce any type of tumbling that a space vehicle might encounter when it is separated from its rocket booster in space.
The Mercury missions that began in 1958 were to see if NASA could get somebody into orbit, and if they did, would they even survive in a low-gravity environment? After going through some intense and strenuous tests to weed out candidates, the famous Mercury 7 got to work. Loads of tests were done, such as eating, thought and motion exercises, and more, to see if the human body could handle normal functioning. Once the basics were covered, they even had longer orbital missions in order to see what longer exposure to a low-gravity environment might have on the body and test potential spaceflight speeds.
To provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Once the early Mercury tests were nearly done in May 1961, President Kennedy announced to Congress and the public, admittedly surprising some of the astronauts and NASA personnel, that the US would land a man on the moon and bring him back, all before the end of the decade. While there was a plan already in the works to expand the US's space capabilities, this dramatically shrunk the time frame, giving NASA about 8.5 years to figure it all out. The NASA budget rose nearly 4 to 5% of the federal budget over the next few years, spending just over $32 billion, which is about $276 billion today. NASA employed more than 34,000 employees and more than 370,000 contractors across the US, meaning everyone was scrambling and working their hardest to fulfill the president's promise. Gemini planning kicked off in 1961 and was geared for the questions and difficulties of space flight itself. If the astronauts were going to the moon, they would need to anticipate potential problems. Gemini was to train astronauts to transition from the orbit flights of the Mercury program to the moon flights of the Apollo program, which also started at around the same time. The first years always involved planning and the development of technology, with the actual flights coming later. This is where the first spacewalks happened, with the first space suits trying to fix problems from the outside of the craft as well as from the inside. This is also where the practice for docking and rendezvous with other spacecraft, done remotely for now, were tested, as well as the continued monitoring the human body in prolonged spaceflight conditions. The program came to a close once a good group of astronauts had been trained and were deemed sufficient enough to be transferred to the growing Apollo project.
Of 218,096 miles away. The astronauts departed from their crew quarters after checking out their suits. They departed from their crew quarters at 6:27.
The Apollo program also began officially in 1961, and their goal was to get astronauts to the moon. The first years were all tests and astronaut selection, while helping with the Gemini program. The first Apollo flight mission in 1967, however, ended in tragedy. The rocket failed to launch, and the command module was set ablaze by an electrical fire and took the lives of 3 astronauts. Gus Grissom, veteran of the Mercury missions, Ed White, the first American to walk in space and do an EVA, and Roger B. Chaffee, Capcom expert and the youngest astronaut selected for a spaceflight mission at the time. After this, the next few test flights and experiments went on without a crew, leading to the exclusion of Apollo 2 and 3 altogether, and the rest largely going unrecognized as they were not manned flights. The first crewed flight after the events of Apollo 1 was Apollo 7. It orbited the Earth and tested its communication abilities by being the first spacecraft to have the crew speak on live television to the world. Later missions introduced the new and powerful Saturn V rocket, orbited the moon many times over, and featured the first manual docking test of the lunar module. With each mission, NASA was getting one step closer to their lunar goal. Finally, Apollo 11's famous 1969 moon landing captivated millions and still draws attention to this day. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins became immortal, forever to be written in the history books for ages to come. Yet, they weren't just there to take pictures and to wave at the camera. They were there to run experiments. Them and the rest of the Apollo missions, except for 13, ran multiple tests on the lunar surface to see if any valuable resources could be found, signs of any life, past or present, measure seismic activity, and trying to find the components of solar wind. These weren't just done for the enrichment of Earth, though, but possibly to examine the moon's surface in order to build a base, as evidenced by earlier projections from the US Air Force's suggestion of the Lunix project and Project Horizon. It was a hope to conduct future missions from the moon, with the later space shuttles ferrying people and resources back and forth, like interplanetary big rigs. But as the space race died down in the 1970s and funding drained, NASA had to limit its planning and had to work on smaller projects and experiments. The Space Shuttle program did become a ferry system to the International Space Station, but never to the moon, and was ultimately cancelled too. NASA is still planning for future space exploration and has even re-proposed a moon base, as suggested by the goals of the current Artemis missions. In Starfield, we are to play a character that is part of this long line of space exploration, pushing the limits and boundaries of human knowledge with the group known as Constellation. While Constellation may or may not be the direct descendants of NASA and the NASA missions, it still builds heavily on the same drives and goals. Watching the very first trailer again with the knowledge of the early NASA missions gives the game a whole new perspective. Although there are varied opinions of the game itself, at least an attempt was made to continue the legacy, in some small way, to those who braved space travel and even had given their lives in the pursuit of exploration. I'm not sure how well this video will do, but if you would like me to cover the great events of the Soviet cosmonauts, let me know in the comments below. I would be glad to. Lastly, please like and share the video if possible, and please subscribe if you want to show more support. It's easy and it's free. I especially thank you for watching. This is Eric, the Lone Pine Wolfman, and remember, never stop learning.